Professor McBride, Kevin McBride, is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Connecticut and the former director of research at the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center. He's conducted archaeological and historical research throughout New England, Block Island, Baja, Mexico, the Caribbean, and Portugal. His research interests include indigenous and colonial cultural and historical landscapes, maritime adaptations, historical archaeology, underwater archaeology, and battlefield archaeology, which we'll hear about tonight. He's a member of the Society for American Archaeology, the American Anthropological Association, the Society for Historical Archaeology, and the Society for American Ethnohistory. He's also an adjunct faculty at the Institute for Exploration. He's a former member of the Board of Directors of the Connecticut Museum of Natural History and on the Governor's Task Force on Indian Affairs. And as you have probably seen with articles in the Day and the Mystic Times, he has written numerous articles on Native American and colonial archaeology, ethnohistory, archaeobotany, underwater archaeology, and battlefield archaeology. Eminently qualified. So, with that, you've got the floor.
Crowd for Wednesday night. I appreciate it. I really do. Just a couple of just housekeeping things. Those journals or the societies I'm a member of, it's only when I pay my dues, and it's not real often. But I'm going to talk to you tonight about the Pequot War. And most of you know something about the Pequot War. First major conflict between English and Native people in the northeastern United States. It led to the defeat and essentially temporary dissolution of the Pequot tribe. The most significant battle of the war occurred just up the street on Pequot Hill, the English attack on the fortified Pequot village at Mystic. And we're also going to talk about another little-known battle, although it was probably the longest and most intensive of the Pequot War, is what we call the Battle of the English Withdrawal, which occurred a few hours after the Mystic Fort battle, as the English fought their way to the Thames River against the mobilized Pequot force, what they had left. So we'll sort of go through that and talk about new research, etc. I mean, we've been doing this for close to 15, 17 years now, and when we started these projects, we've done many other battlefield projects as well, but the Pequot War project is probably the most significant that we've worked on, and it's a commitment. We've looked at 6 battlefields. And when we started this project, Battlefields of the Pequot War, I thought I was an expert on the Pequot War. I had been studying it for 15, 20 years before that. I thought I knew everything there was to know, and I couldn't have been more wrong. There's something to be said for having the opportunity, and I thank the Pequot Museum for this, that I was able to build a really good team, and we spent 20 years looking into the Pequot War and related issues and topics. And when you spend that much time, you finally begin to get a sense of things. And during that process, we discovered some new information that had not been seen before by historians or anyone else. So most of this project is talking about the battlefield archaeology, which is the process of recovering battlefield archaeology artifacts, integrating them into the historical record to produce a reasonable narrative of what happened. And I think we've done that by and large. And that's what we're going to talk about today. But I just want to underscore, too, that this is ongoing. I and my students are in my lab at UConn every day looking over battlefield objects and looking at domestic objects from sites that we've excavated. So you're familiar with that image on the right. That's a woodcut of the Mystic battle, commissioned by one of the one of the commanders, John Underhill, in 1638. And it reflects a reasonably accurate, a fairly accurate depiction of the battle, although it's a bit condensed, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So I do want to acknowledge the National Park Service American Battlefield Protection Program, who we consider our new best friends. They have supported us with about 15 grants to not only study the Pequot War, but others as well. So, and we're not finished. We still have, a couple of miles of one of the battlefields to cover, so we'll be still actively doing that. But their purpose is to identify, protect, and preserve battlefields that are important in American history. And this is a very special program within the Park Service. They receive their funding directly from Congress, so there's no budget cut per se. Whatever side of the aisle you're on, you want your American battlefields to be protected and preserved. So it originally started with funding Civil War battlefield projects, because Civil War battlefields were and still are very much in danger. And then over the decades, since 1985, they moved on to Revolutionary War battlefield, then War of 1812, and we were the first institution team to sort of get funding to study 17th century battlefield. So this is battlefield archaeology. It's involved with two things. One is simply to document the battlefield, and we do that primarily with integrating artifacts and the historical record, as I said, but the artifacts are largely recovered through metal detecting. We do an enormous metal detecting is the basis for almost all of our finding, because most of the battlefield objects that one would expect to find, with a couple of exceptions, are metallic in nature. So we identify and define the battlefield. The other aspect of this is placing the battlefield in a larger, economic, cultural, ideological, technological perspective. And I think we all would we would all agree that conflict and warfare is a real window into a society in terms of its culture, ideology, technology, economics, political systems, social systems, etc. And we see that in conflicts throughout history. So we saw a real opportunity not just to document the stuff on the battlefield, technical terms. There's stuff, junk, and crap. We'll get into that in a little while. But also to begin to learn something far more about the colonial and native history and cultures of the region, which we did. It's a very interesting side. So the last thing I'm going to talk about tonight, after I go through sort of the battlefield stuff, is we were fortunate enough to find some Pequot domestic sites of small villages, a large village, 6 of them, through our survey, which was totally unexpected. We had no idea we would find these things. And they have turned out to be the most significant sites I've ever found in my career. And we're still working on them. I was just whining to someone back there that, I was in the lab today and I was going through all this stuff, and, it's non-ending, it's never ending, but it's really cool stuff. I'll talk a little bit about that. So it begins with narrative research. We want to reach out, we want to find. We've gone all over the world. Well, how would we go over the world? We've been all throughout North America, England, searching for primary sources associated with the Pequot War. And we found a lot of new ones that no one really knew about. But you're probably familiar with the major. Underhill and Mason. Mason was the commander of Connecticut forces during the Pequot War. And he and several other principals wrote narratives of the war, which provide the basis. The big four, and maybe a dozen others, snippets here and there, provide the basis for our historical documentation on the Pequot War. And they provide a guide for us to how to interpret the archaeological record that we find on the battlefield. Mason's was very important, and we rely on Mason quite a bit, and we rely on Underhill quite a bit, and others. The Mystic Fort battle is pretty well documented in these narratives. Interestingly, the battle after, which we call the Battle of the English Withdrawal, which is a 10-hour, 6-mile fighting retreat, it's off everybody's radar. Barely mentioned in any of these narratives, and we were able to extract about 3 sentences that form the basis for our, investigation and pursuit. But that's interesting. And Mason, one of the things that we do when we're looking at these primary sources, and many of you are historians, is you need to contextualize the sources that you're using, the primary sources. Who wrote them? Why? What are the potential biases? Do they have goals and objectives that we need to be aware of? What's their background, et cetera, et cetera? And as it turns out, 20 years after the war, John Winthrop Jr., then governor of Connecticut, recently elected in 1659, 20 years after the war, he solicits John Mason and Lyon Gardner, the commander of Saybrook Fort, to write their narratives of the Pequot War. That's a little strange. 20 years after the war, and what's this all about? Two of the important narratives by Underhill and a guy named Vincent were written within a year after the war. And they were published in London. It's unclear to what extent anybody, in North America saw them. But Mason and Gardner were important. And I'm not going to go into this because this is a topic you'll go brain dead. I'll just tell you that right now. It was all about soliciting a narrative of the war for Connecticut, who did not have a patent or a charter. Big deal. And they were afraid of being subsumed under either the governor of New York or Massachusetts Bay. They needed a charter and patent. And the only basis they had for arguing one with the newly restored Charles II was arguing that the land they were claiming and the land they had rights to was conquered by the Pequots in a just war. Really important. And if you ever read Mason again, you will see in that narrative a section called Grounds for the Pequot War. And that document was sent with others to Charles II in 1661-62 to apply for a patent for Connecticut, which they received based upon their argument that they acquired the land in a just war through right of conquest, which is recognized throughout Europe and even recognized in indigenous North America. The reason we know these narratives got to John Winthrop is that handwriting there, Lieutenant Guy Gardner, that's John Winthrop Jr.'s handwriting. So it gets up to Hartford, he looks at it, he goes, great. And he puts a title on it. And that's how Masons came to us. That's an actual real image of a computer program that we use to sort of crunch the narratives and spew out a reasonable timeline comparing them. Long story. But the purpose of that is to come up with a battlefield timeline. So what we want to do, a traditional battlefield archaeology, is going out with your metal detectors and, sampling the battlefield, and you end up with a boundary, right? And a lot of stuff, a lot of battlefield artifacts. Very static. Does it tell you anything about the battle? No, not really. It tells you that a battle took place. So the key to battlefield reconstruction is adding a temporal dimension to that spatial dimension. And if you can break the battle down into segments of time and actions and anticipated archaeological signatures from those actions, then that's when you go into the field and you begin to, recover, identify, and interpret. And the interpretation is an ongoing process. It's daily discussions throughout the day in the field. How well does what we're finding match historical record, and so on and so forth. A real process, but eventually it works. So our methods, field methods, and techniques, we rely heavily, as I said, on metal detecting. We also rely on some other remote sensing techniques, ground penetrating radar, magnetometry, electrical resistivity. We use other source of information, LiDAR, laser imaging of ground surfaces that give you a really good topographic map that you can sort of remove some of the modern stuff, because one of the goals of this of battlefield analysis is you want to be able to see the battlefield as the combatant saw it at the time, as much as humanly possible. So there's a lot of military terrain analysis. There's a lot of other types of information that are brought into that. So when you are in the field and you walk around first before you do anything else, you begin to have a sense of what the battlefield may have looked at. Obviously, a lot of it's been altered, but a lot of it hasn't. Different types of vegetation don't really change the landscape. Construction does, residential or commercial construction does. But even residential construction, we find a lot of battle objects, because these house lots are not that extensively disturbed. We use a combination of metal detecting. We do dig holes. We use a lot of geographic information system. That's how everything's integrated, so we can look at spatial analysis of various things. And, for every one battlefield object, we recover 500 non-battle related objects. These are busy places. There's been 350 to 400 years of land use following these battles. And the battlefield is littered with information on previous land use. If you want to get an idea about land use over from the 16th through 20th century, land use on any piece of property, metal detector. Documents aren't going to tell you that much detail, but we're talking quarrying, plowing, planting, fencing, just the list goes on. And we find a lot of those objects. We also find, so that's what we would call crap. Sorry. But let me defend myself a little bit. They are historically important objects. And those objects we consider them important. We'll conserve them and turn them over to the local historical society. The stuff on the right is crap. Or junk, one or the other, I can't remember. But it's like the most common artifact that we find in these battlefield projects are pop tab and 22 bullets. So everybody likes to drink beer and shoot stuff, basically what we come away with. But it also reflects, as I said, the land use. And we found some other interesting things too. We found diamond rings for people, wedding rings for people. The best one was we found one of the landowners, his great-grandfather's pilot wings from the World War I. I mean, that's pretty cool. We have the largest collection of matchbox trucks, and the list goes on. So we also recover battle related objects. Musket balls, these are impacted and melted. There's impacted and dropped. You know, what we want to do with these, even if they're all mushed up and impacted and they're not perfect spheres, we can still calculate the diameter, which is related to the caliber or tactics, based on the specific gravity of lead. So any one of those blobs, we can have it give us a diameter. And that's important. You know, a drop musket ball tells you where an English soldier stood. Pequot didn't really have any firearms to speak of, so the vast majority of the 1,000 musket balls we recovered were fired by the English. You know, we can tell some things from impact. Sometimes we can tell direction of fire. Sometimes we can tell, you know, tactics. If you're loading your weapon with, you know, 6 to 8 small diameter ball in a 30 diameter range, you know, your enemy is not far away and they're usually massed. A very common tactic when attacking a village with women and children, by the way. And we see that at Mystic. We've seen it at every battlefield where a village was attacked by the English. So we look at the distribution, you know, situationally too. You know, the English would tend to use larger diameter shots. It fits the caliber of their muskets if the enemy is at a distance, because it can be theoretically aimed. And it's not going to disperse. Like I said, if it's close and the enemy is massed, they'll use smaller diameter. So you can sort of see that in there. So we also rely really heavily on analysis. I mean, most of the stuff we recover, we have no clue what it is. Sometimes you don't have a clue what it is because it's encrusted with rust. Sometimes we don't have a clue what it is because we just don't have a clue what it is. You know, there's a lot of research that goes into identifying this stuff. The internet's our friend. There's so much stuff there. Plus, we have access to a lot of other site reports, material culture, but it's a real process, you know, identifying that it's 17th century battle related. In this case, you know, what we have here, you know, ironically, this was one of the last objects we had x-rays. I didn't think of it. Yeah, look at it. Thing in the right, left. Doesn't look like it. Well, when we x-rayed it, these things, that brightness means hand wrought, and that size means they're probably rivets. Okay. And we looked at the shape once we cleaned it off. And as it turns out, a piece of English armor, it's a corselet. And we know the English took with them 20 corselets on the expedition. Here's a gun part on the bottom. You know, what is this? You know, is it like a barbed wire tack? You know, turns out once we x-rayed it and cleaned it, it's a prison spring for a flintlock. So that tells us, you know, something as well. Then, you know, they have flintlocks, which were supposed to be very rare in that early period. Although, based on our research, it dominated the English armament, flintlocks. But they still use matchlocks as well. Heavy, cumbersome, but they pack a real punch because they're 70 caliber, and they can go a long distance because of the size of the barrel. So they had their use too. But for maneuver, you need the smaller barreled flintlocks. And we do see evidence of pistols as well. Here's some musket rests, which, you know, indicate on the upper right, which indicate, you know, presence of matchlocks. And then we also do a lot with musket ball distributions to, you know, reconstruct tactics and things of that. We're not going to go over this too much. It's very complicated, and, you know, it's interesting, quite interesting actually, about the causes leading up to the Pequot War. A lot of competition for resources, rising tensions, the Pequot subjugating neighboring tribes and their resentment and their willingness to ally with the English. This is so complicated. And we still look at that. But the war must also be understood in the context of the trade. The Dutch between 1612 and 1637, and the English 1630s to 37. So these are the kinds of things that they are trading. Duffel cloth here being, without a doubt, the most sought after trade object by native people, including the Pequot. These are second mattocks for breaking up tough ground and everything else. And we find these things both on the battlefield, because we discovered what English soldiers and native soldiers are bringing into battle with them. Based on various contexts, it's pretty interesting. All of them had jaw harps, if you know what those are, and most had a pair of scissors, and other variety of other things as well. But underlying that trade, it's all about furs. But to get furs, you needed wampum, which was abundant in Long Island Sound, Connecticut coastline and Long Island Sound. In fact, the Dutch called Eastern Long Island Sound the mint of wampum production, and they referred to wampum as the source and mother of the fur trade. So if you want the quality furs from the north, native, Iroquois, Huron, Abenaki, you needed good quality trade goods, but that wasn't enough. You needed wampum as well, which it's not a currency in a Dutch English sense, but think of it as an indigenous, ritual, ceremonial, ideological currency. There's not a single agreement that took place in 17th century native Northeast America that didn't involve the exchange of wampum. So the Pequots undertook a 15-year process to subjugate neighboring tribes to control that fur and wampum trade. And the tribes marked in yellow are those tribes that either allied with the Pequots or were subjugated by the Pequots and forced into an alliance. So by the time of the Pequots, by the time of the Pequot War, had spent 20 years of expansionist policies, making war upon their neighbors, integrating their men and territory into their system. They not only had a formidable military and military alliance, they were really experienced. Without a doubt, the Pequots were the most experienced military in New England on the eve of the Pequot War, even though they didn't have any firearms. Here's where we are in the sort of picture here, the Mystic Fort campaign, and we'll get there. I'm going to quickly go through the other ones just to give you the context. One of the things we always find interesting, because we've done work, battlefield surveys in Fairfield, Saybrook, Block Island, of course, Groton, a couple of them. Each community has a completely different perspective on the Pequot War from what happened in their town. Fairfield has really not much an idea about Mystic. How many of you guys know about Fairfield battle? Yeah. See, we don't know, and that's fine. It's very interesting to see that pattern. And residents of those towns often have different perspectives on the war, sort of negative, both negative and positive. So here are the battlefields that we're talking about that we've done. We've done, Block Island a little bit, Mystic Fort, English Withdrawal, Saybrook Fort, Fairfield Swamp Fight. Weathersfield wasn't really a battle. It was just a Pequot attack on settlers, and where they attacked them is gone. The river channels moved and wiped out. Paquiag wasn't really a battle, but it's where Saskis, the chief Pequot sachem, was killed by the Mohawk. He was actually, ironically, trying to get to the Mohawk to enlist their, after the Pequot defeat, Mystic and Fairfield, to enlist their aid against the English. So the Pequot War started in early September 1636, when Massachusetts Bay landed 90 soldiers along the Thames River and attacked and burned Pequot villages and corn in retaliation for the deaths of some English traders a couple of years before. But long story, we're not going to sort of go there. But that started the war. In retaliation, the Pequots laid siege to Saybrook Fort, at the mouth of the Connecticut River, for the next 6 months. And during those 6 months, they killed 35 to 50 English. They won every engagement against the English, including against Lyon Gardner, who was a very competent soldier, officer in the 30 Years' War in the Lowlands, as was Mason and Underhill. They all knew each other. And he couldn't figure them out. Pequot was just always getting the better of them. And they were pretty successful. What happened next, for really interesting, complicated reasons, which I'm sorry to tease you with, we're not going to talk about it. The Pequots decide to attack Wethersfield. So up to that point, they did not attack the upriver English settlements of Windsor, Wethersfield, because they didn't want to really expand the war. I don't think. I have some theories about it, but Saybrook was fair game in a sense. It was a military installation. It's where the Mass Bay met and launched their attack on the Pequots. So they laid siege to that, and that project was really, really important, significant for us, because there was Lyon Gardner recording all this stuff in Underhill to some extent. We got a really good sense of Pequot tactics and command structure and weapons and all kinds of things that we use to later go back and reinterpret what we were finding in Mystic. So a week later, Connecticut declares war. They had ample opportunity to do that before in the previous 6 months. Why didn't they? Because Connecticut and Plymouth felt that Massachusetts Bay actions attacking the Pequots in the Thames River was unjustified. They would not declare war with Mass Bay. They would not join in a war with them. Because, as I said, they did not feel their Mass Bay action Pequot was justified. Now it's justified with Fairfield. They attacked settlements. They killed women and children. The first time in the war, captured 2 English girls. Later, they were rescued by the Dutch. But that was the grounds for a just war. Now, the Pequot, I'm sure the English were not planning on taking Pequot territory and claiming right of conquest. They were petrified. The reason they, declared war and went after the Pequots is they were petrified. They thought that, if they didn't make a very strong statement against the Pequot, the massacre at Virginia, that occurred in 1622, would occur all over again. So in Virginia, on a single day, the Powhatan Confederacy killed 500 English. They were petrified of that, absolutely petrified. And it reflected in a lot of the letters between colonial leaders. So here's the Mystic campaign, which we won't go into a great deal. What we really are interested in is, the upshot of this is Mason had orders from the magistrates in Connecticut to land the Thames River and attack the Pequots in a frontal assault. Traditional English battle formations, you march up, you wave the flag, et cetera, et cetera. It never worked. Underhill knew this, Gardner knew this, and when Mason asked for their help, they said, no, unless you change your plan. You cannot, the Pequots will not stand to you. They will retreat, they will lure you in, ambushes. You have to do a battle plan based on surprise and attack. That's surprise and speed, which is what he did. He sailed by Pequot territory, making sure he was in full view of the Pequots on the coast, sails to Narragansett Bay with 80 native allies, 60 Wangunk and 20 Mohegan. He picks up 200 or so Narragansett, and he begins this march, 2-day march, 35 miles, ending at Porter's Rock, where they camped the night before the battle. And their intent was to attack the 2 Pequot fortified villages, the one in Mystic, and then the one at Fort Hill and Groton, Wyanchonks, which was Saskis, the chief Pequot sachem's village.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Porter's Rocks, are those on River Road?
Pardon?
Porter's Rocks, are those on River Road?
Yeah, you can see them when you drive by. And they're definitely Porter's Rocks. We found the English encampment, we found the native encampment there. In Porter, by the way, we thought it meant, Portersville. It was named after the big shipbuilder. No, Porter means century in Old English. And if you read Mason's narrative, he talks about 2 centuries being on the rocks, being able to hear the Pequots celebrating or drumming, 2 miles away at the fort. So that's what Porter basically means. A little fact, useless fact, but could use it. So the Battle of Mystic Fort. English get up at 1 a.m. They march 2 miles to the fort. It's moonlit night, wasn't pitch black. They get there just at dawn. They, proceed with their battle plan. They surround the fort, fire an initial volley, and then Mason enters the fort with half of his. Let me just back up. So the 77 English split into 2 divisions of 36 men each. So, one under Underhill, who's was supposed to go to the southwest entrance, Mason to the northeast, and once they get there, they were to surround the fort and fire a volley through the gaps in the palisades, and then enter the fort. So Mason gets there first. He's got the shorter route to go. As he's approaching the entrance, there's a native sentry who, he alerts everybody. He goes, Ona, Englishman, and a dog starts barking. So Mason, even though Underhill is not yet in place, because he's got a longer way to go, has to start the battle early. So they rush up to the palisade. They fire a volley through. I'm sure they caused quite a bit of damage. And then 18 men with Mason enter the fort to engage them in hand-to-hand fighting, to save the plunder, kill them by the sword and save the plunder. They meant to do some damage. I can't say specifically they intended to kill women and children, but their intent was to send a message to all Native people throughout the region. And I strongly suspect that, even though it's not mentioned, I strongly suspect they did intend to do that. And the outcome is also evident for that. So Mason enters the fort, and within 10 minutes, 15 minutes, we calculate, he lost 60% of his men, killed or wounded. He was getting the crap kicked out of him. And he was, because the Pequots got intelligence of the English coming from Narragansett Bay, and they reinforced the fort the night before with 150 of their best men. So instead of encountering 75 men, Mason encounters 225. And, they're losing the battle. And meanwhile, Underhill is a no-show. He's not there yet. Mason says, we can't do it this way. We have to burn them. So that's when he sets fire to the fort. I'm sure it was a backup plan. And as Mason says, with God's providence, there was a stiff northeast wind. They quickly fanned the flames, and within minutes, the fort is engulfed. By the time Underhill gets there, he's lost the element of surprise. He can barely get in the fort because it's already on fire and has to retreat. And then the English surround the fort to prevent anyone from escaping. And most of the action at that point is off the southwest which is the only avenue for the Pequots to escape because of the flames elsewhere. Here's our battlefield reconstruction. So we were able to match it really well with the narrative. Mason in particular. Mason's a really, really good chronicler. He is careful. We know it's him because he's the only one that uses dates and times. He only talks about what he experienced, and if he talks about what somebody else experienced, he says, I can't speak for, but I heard this. So it's good. Narrative is good. So a lot of this is based upon Mason and Underhill's narrative. So, we can see a lot of small shot here where they fired their first volley. We can see as the battle progresses, larger shot. Here's the English positions after the fort's on fire, as they attempt to flee the flames. So it was a very, very good, tight reconstruction and a really good fit with the historical record. The end result, within an hour or less, 400 people were dead. Pequot were dead. Half of them burned to death. Which had quite an impact not only on native allies who were with them, but on the English soldiers as well. No one had ever experienced this before. Mason did, Underhill did, and as we now know, about a third of the men with Mason were veterans of the 30 Years' War. They did, because that was a common practice in the lowlands, is lay siege and just wipe out anybody if they captured a city. So here's the Battle of the English Withdrawal. So here's Mystic. These little black dots, those are musket balls, 900 of them. These little red triangles, those are brass arrow points, fired by either the Pequot, the Wollongong, the Mohegan, or the Narragansett. Quite amazing. Now, the gaps are where we haven't completed the survey as yet. This gap's real. They started here. So it's a little circuitous. You can see that, right? There, as we eventually figured out, the English are following a path or a trail, Pequot path or trail. And that Pequot trail winds around wetlands, which the English preferred because the Pequots were ambushing them constantly from wetlands where they could hide, the thickets. So that's what this is about. And as we later found out, once we discovered 6 Pequot villages along the way, which we didn't know anything about, they're located along the trail as well. That path is connecting Pequot domestic sites. Now it gave us a really good clue on where else to look for these as well.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
In that previous slide, which one is Fort Hill?
Fort Hill is down here. About there. About 2.5 miles from...
So down north of the highway there?
Yeah, it's where Route 1 and Groton Long Point or 215 kind of meet. There's a water tower there that kind of marks the location. Yeah.
Quick question, do we know how big the fort was on top of the Mystic Fort was?
Yeah, it was about 1.25 acres, so 220 or 30 feet. It's right on, not Allen Street, it's right on Pequot Avenue.
Okay. Tower?
No, north of the tower. If you know where the Mason statue was, it's about, 400 yards north of that.
I was thinking the only fresh water is down below where a lot more.
That's true, but we found evidence of springs on the top of that hill. But you're right about the water thing. I mean, that's an important. These are permanent villages. They have to have a water source. So even though one wasn't readily visible, as we checked into it, we found several springs that they were probably using. So here's just another view. So that Battle of the English Withdrawal was a very significant battle. No one talks about it, but we were dumbfounded with what we were finding. We thought we would be lucky to find a couple of buttons dropped by the English in the retreat. We had no clue from the narratives that there would be such an intense battle, and it was. This was 4 miles of the most intense fighting we've seen in any 17th century battle. 2,500 battle objects, that's not including the domestic objects that we found, we'll talk about later. Intense fighting. And the reason the Pequots suffered so many casualties is even though they've been really successful against English tactics up till Mystic, they were so enraged when they saw what happened at Mystic. I mean, you can imagine 400 of your kin, dead, 200 burned to death. In their rage, as the English said, they just ran down the hill as if to overrun us, and that hill being Pequot Hill, and the rear guard stopped and fired, and then the battle began. But because they were so enraged with what the English had done, they abandoned all the tactics that had previously worked for them. And as the English said, they were hazarding themselves in the open field. So by the end of the day, the Pequots probably lost 500 fighting men. And that is why the Pequots abandoned their country. They had no ability to continue the war against the English at that point. This is another view. Yes?
So is this, the withdrawal, is this where it happened at Pequot Woods?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And I just want to add that this battlefield that you see right now, this, and these two, this has just been acquired by the town of Groton. The town of Groton and Groton Open Space now owns 70% of the battlefield, completely, and all the domestic sites that are in it. We could not have been more pleased when that happened. It did just happen. Yeah.
Excuse me, is that an additional parcel called the Wolf Brook?
Yes. Yep. The Wolfbrook parcel. So we haven't, as I said, we haven't finished. We kind of stopped there. Time, money, we were exhausted. This was like the the 7th or 8th year we were doing this. We needed a break. We needed to sit back, look at what we have, and then plan for the next step. So these are the things that we were finding on the battlefield. English part weapons, they're dropping, breaking a lot of stuff. These are the weapons. A little bit of everything: gun barrels, armor, flintlock parts, matchlock parts, ramrod, tips, gun worms to clean the barrel of the gun, and other things, just wide range of stuff.
Have you found human remains, bones?
No, and we don't expect to, nor do we want to. We don't expect to because you raise an interesting question. We did not expect to because human remains lying on the ground wouldn't last more than a couple of years, and they'd be gone. But did the Pequots bury the dead? And I have to say, in my experience on other battlefield projects, Native people always buried their dead. They did not leave anybody on the battlefield. They went to great lengths to recover them, sometimes even in the heat of battle. So our suspicion is, with no proof, because no one's ever found a mass cemetery, the Pequots probably did bury the dead. Or perhaps if they didn't, maybe they cremated, or maybe they created some memorials, memory piles, stone piles, things of that nature. We consider all that and we look for all that, but if human remains are found, it really kicks it, because this is a federal project, it kicks in a lot of issues under federal jurisdiction under the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act. So it's, we're not unhappy. And what would we find out anyway? From finding them or doing an analysis. So these are personal objects in English: pipes and jaw harps and scissors and dice and buttons and aglets and other kinds of stuff. And these are the native weapons. One thing that's not depicted here, which I'll show you, they were probably using a lot of trade axes as well, iron trade axes. And these points reflect the stylistic differences reflect different native groups. The ones at the top, very distinct, are what we call conical points. They're made by the Wangam in Wethersfield, Hartford, actually even further north. A couple of these we know are Pequot, because they were found inside the fort. A couple of Narragansett, because we know that from other Narragansett sites. The others, it's kind of tough, and we probably never will figure that out. And then we have a lot of native personal items, a lot of brass amulets. Here's a brass pipe made from cut up kettle. Jesuit rings were actually pretty common. We got out a dozen of those. Those are brass rings the Jesuits would hand out. But no Jesuits down here. They're getting them second, third, fourth hand from northern native people. But brass is important. Brass, copper is in the realm of the underwater panther, who's a very powerful being. And he guards the copper sources at the Great Lakes. He's half lynx, half serpent. Serpent tail is made from copper scales. Very powerful, healing power. Most of the native men were either carrying scraps of brass in their pockets or pouches, or wearing amulets. Quinnipiac. That's just basic. So after the Mystic Fort battle, after the Battle of the English draw, probably within 1 week or 10 days, the Pequots began to abandon their country. And they're going a lot of different directions to seek refuge with kin, friendly tribe, whatever. One group, the main group under Sassacus, wants to continue the war, and they're going down the Connecticut coast with the intention of eventually reaching the Mohawk, who they were bringing a large gift of wampum, and they hoped they could enlist the aid of the Mohawk against the English. Ironically, the Mohawk killed Sassacus for their own, reasons and interests. But the last battle of the Pequot War is the Battle of Monocomic, Fairfield Swamp, which we also were able to document. Unfortunately, if you're in the Fairfield, there's a lot of disturbance. I-95 went right through the middle of the swamp. There were pockets that were intact, and then the war is over, and in 1638 the Treaty of Hartford was signed, which basically stated, relevant to the Pequots, they will no longer be called Pequot, but given to the Mohegan and Narragansett, they will be called Mohegan and Pequot, and they shall no longer live in their homeland. Neither one of those stipulations lasted particularly long. So I'm going to go through this quick. I want to check the time. I don't want to. Okay, we'll finish up 10 minutes. All right, so one of the unexpected. Oh, that's it. One of the unexpected results of this is we found underneath all of the stuff, battle-related objects, once we peel that out, we found evidence of 6 native villagers. No idea they were there. In the last few years, and these are depictions of them, we decided to excavate one which we call Cluna Hill. For an archaeologist, this is amazing discovery. Single moment in time, almost. It was occupied from November of 1636 to May 26, 1637. Just to be able to date it that tightly is pretty amazing. But it's a single occupation. There were 6 households, separated, well separated, each with a household midden or garbage pile. filled with, because of the shellfish, filled with all kinds of preserved food remains. And here it is, and this is what led us to it. Just this quote by Mason. As they're coming down Pequot Hill, he goes, there was at the foot of the hill a small brook. Fishtown Brook? I think it's Fishtown Brook, right? Fishtown Brook, where we rested and refreshed ourselves. We then marched on towards Pequot Harbor, and falling upon several wigwams, burnt them. Wow, right? Of course, that's all we had to locate it. But we felt confident about Mason. He was always chronologically correct in his narrative. So we knew that if we could find where the English stopped to rest and refresh themselves, and we figured, 250 native and English men stopping to rest and refresh themselves, they're going to drop stuff. And that's what we went for. And we found the spot along the, Fishtown Brook. Then we began to follow the musket ball. Unfortunately, and I'll admit it, archaeologists aren't always that smart. We spent a lot of time looking for that village up here. Nice flat land, good cultivatable land, nothing. No sign of domestic. So we finally figured out, why are they going to put themselves on top of the best arable land? Plus, we assume they want to be hidden a bit, they're down below. And within 5 minutes, we had this village metal detecting. We would have never found this digging test hole, never. But we did.
In that picture, where's Noack Ledger Road?
Noack Ledger Road would be...
Just to the left of the circle?
No. Noack Ledger Road would be probably about here. About there.
That seems kind of far.
Well, they didn't know anything about the road, but it's actually interesting. It's located, and I think it may be significant. It's sort of nestled in a semi-hidden area between the two forts. And I'm not going to go into great detail, but there's some things that are going on at that site that we have reason to believe there were some Pequot status, high rank, that were there. And we also think it was a wartime relocation. But, so it was sort of kind of meant to be hidden. But Mason, when they were crossing the stream and beginning their march, they spotted it. Here's
Peter Brook by the Lower Mystic Cemetery.
Pardon?
Would that be the brook by the Lower Mystic Cemetery?
Where's the Lower Mystic Cemetery? On Route 1?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's about a half-mile north of that.
Here's the stuff we got. All kinds of trade goods. Biscayne axes, which were our 17th century axes made by Biscayne, Bay of Biscayne blacksmiths. Other stuff, we knew they burned it. We did some phosphate testing, and we identified several hot spots, which after, surveyed excavation turned out to be structures. They're reprocessing everything. There's not a single object we found, with the exception of a pothook, that the Pequots didn't take apart, rework, and refashion into something more traditional that they're used to. Not a single thing. If you look at that assemblage, you can identify probably 6 to 8 objects represented. Kettles, box, folding knife, and a bunch of other stuff. And, we got Pequot pottery. That's turned out to be very interesting. And here are the excavations, at Pequot Woods. Here are the middens. We're sampling the middens to we wanted to find the extent of the middens for volume purposes when we begin our analysis, and then we began to sample them through excavation. And that's kind of what they look like. Very thin, because this site was not occupied for a particularly long period of time. And we have just started the analysis. There's just so much to process, but we have found some really surprising things. One of the most surprising, and I know you can't see that writing, pig cow, a grain of wheat, a couple of grains of wheat, and a chicken egg. Right? What are they doing with that stuff? Well, we know from Lion Gardner's account in Letters to Winthrop that the Pequots raided Saybrook Fort November 11th and took away 21 great swine, a ram goat, cattle, and sheep. So maybe they grabbed a couple of chickens. I don't know. Maybe they grabbed some grain stores. I don't know. But this is unprecedented. It's probably unprecedented because we're just myopic, tunnel vision. The question for us now is we have pretty good evidence this was acquired on a raid, but a colleague of mine is excavating a fort in Norwalk about the same period of time. He's got pig, he's got wheat, he's got a couple of other things that were probably acquired from the Dutch in trade. So there's the dilemma for us. I prefer the raid theory because it just sounds better. It's more National Geographic, right? But we don't know. We do know, though, that 2 of the households had guns. We find gun flints. That's kind of important. So that part of the story is ongoing, and I'm sure it's going to get real interesting in the not too distant future. So I'm sorry to take so long. I'll stop there, and if you have any questions, I'll be glad to try and answer them. Yes.
Thank you. If they were considering a raid at Saybrook, that would have been a really arduous voyage to bring all that stuff back across 2 rivers.
So the question is, if they raided Saybrook, that's a long journey, 2 rivers. Not a problem. The Pequots and other native peoples along Island Sound had ocean-going dugout canoes. They were 80 feet long. They had beaks or prows to cut through rough water. They could hold 40 men. And when the Pequots raided Wethersfield, Lion Gardner heard about it, and he trains his cannon on a back channel on the far side of the Connecticut River, waiting for the Pequot canoes to come down. And he had already sighted the gun, and he ordered them to be fired, and it hit one of the boats and broke the beak off. It was the same boat that 2 captive English girls were in, so he dodged one there, essentially. But they're going back and forth between Block Island, coastal Connecticut, Long Island, Martha's Vineyard. These are large craft, and they were definitely seaworthy. Yeah.
So according to your map, it looked like everything climaxed on the withdrawal at the sheep farm?
No, I don't mean to suggest that. There is another 2 miles of the battlefield that we have not yet surveyed. The English sources very explicitly state that we got within 2 miles of the Thames River and the Pequot attacks stopped abruptly. And our guess is it's because they just lost too many men. They couldn't continue the battle. In fact, you've heard of Skull Plain in Pequannock. I don't know if you've heard that term. And Pequannock Plains, basically where the track is, that's Pequannock Plains. It was referred to as Skull Plain in the early period of colonial, settlement. And I rely on the Old English Dictionary a lot, and there's only one definition for skull, and it's skull. So I suspect that an event happened there related to the battle, and that could, and that could explain that as well. So there's a lot of events, as you can imagine, given the nature of 17th century sources, that are never discussed. They don't even mention it. And there's so much ink spilled on talking about Mystic Fort, which is a significant battle, but nothing on the withdrawal, the most intense battle. By the end of the withdrawal battle, when the English reached the Thames River, they only had 20 soldiers that were effective. that tells you a lot about, the nature of the fighting that was going on. Yeah, so that's a pretty high percentage. Yes.
The number of 400 or so people killed, they didn't have time to stop and actually count. That was later on somebody telling them.
No, actually, we think they did. Because there was about 2 hours between the end of the Mystic battle and the withdrawal battle, when the English were waiting for signs of their ship. We've seen that in other battlefields. The English sometimes take an inordinate amount of effort to count the number of dead after the battle. And it's confirmed by several independent sources, so we're pretty sure that's the correct number, is 400. There's some speculation that there were only women and children inside the fort. Absolutely not true. And many more were killed, but it looks to be the normal complement of Pequot in a village of that size would probably be about 250 or so. And then with the augmentation of additional fighting men. Yeah.
Dr. McBride, before tonight's lecture, I would have always thought of the massacre at the fort as something of a genocide, but you've changed that perspective tonight, because I didn't realize there were 150 warriors or men of fighting age in the fort. So it puts a whole different light.
It's a good point, but let's keep in mind the English intended probably to kill everyone they could. Now, in terms of genocide, that's a pretty strong word. I think the Puritan policy, English policy, was to commit cultural genocide. They wanted to eliminate the Pequots as a viable social and political entity, so they would never reconstitute, which is why during the course of the war and after, they pursued all the fighting men, executed them. They pursued the sachems, executed them. Any women and children of standing who through intermarriage could potentially reconstitute the tribe, they shipped off into slavery in the Caribbean. There were also a lot of captives that were kept in the colonies, distributed between Mass Bay and Connecticut, but they were not, people of standing. They wouldn't have had an opportunity through intermarriage to reconstitute. Yes?
I read that the Narragansetts, seeing the extraordinary brutality that the English, how they waged war, they left the English. They went back home, basically,
Well,
after that battle.
they went back. You're right that they said after the battle, they said something like, "Match it. This is evil. It kills too many men." That is the first time Native people or English, a lot of the English soldiers, had ever seen such destruction. But the reason they went home was out of fear. The Pequots actually counterattacked 3 times when the English were on the hill after the battle, Mystic battle, and in one of those instances, the English fought off the Pequots, but the Narragansetts basically said, we don't have any arrows left, you don't have any ammunition left, we're deathly afraid of the Pequots, we're out of here. So that group trying to get back to Narragansett was intercepted by the Pequots, and they sent word back to Underhill and Mason, help us out. And of course their reaction was, okay, but you guys are jerks about this. They go out, they rescue the Narragansett, and they come back. But the English never trusted the Narragansett. They relied very heavily on their Wangunk and Mohegan allies, it appears. Didn't trust the Narragansetts. But, keep in mind, for the English and the native allies to get through a 10-hour battle, there's no way they can do that without a lot of support from their native allies.
I don't think the Narragansetts trusted the English either.
Not after that. No. In fact, that was the beginning of really bad relationship between Narragansett and the English. Yes?
Just to make a note, as far as the battle is concerned, and after the battle, when the Pequots came back to their homeland, and the Treaty of Patrick was signed, and at that time, my sister and I, Pequot here, we grew into such strong families that they figured it was just too many of us. And that's why they divided us and set us apart on Long Hill, not Long Hill, Long Pond. Separated us on the east side and separated us on the west side, because they did not want the families to grow to proportion that they might have a problem in the near future. So they said there's too many of them, because we did come back to our lands, and so now it's reservation, but we did come back to our lands, huh?
A different location.
In a different location.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
That was English policy. Keep the Pequots divided, keep them separate, don't allow them to, come together, because they're still dangerous. And, but you're still here. And it's really a testament to the resilience and your leadership in the 17th century. I mean, there's some brilliant Pequot leaders who pulled you out of, the black hole, so to speak, and, very politically astute. And that's really, a good story. It's a long one, but, eventually resulted, as you said, you're back in your homeland. Yeah.
How many Pequots were there originally? I mean, how big was the population?
So that's always a difficult thing to answer because the information, but, well, their homeland was basically southeastern Connecticut, and that's where they lived. 28 villages, probably before the smallpox epidemic of 1633-34. We estimate 8,000 Pequot. After the epidemic, 4,000. That epidemic, as I said, was just a couple of years before the Pequot War. After the war, probably 2,500 were left, and many of those were dispersed. The two main groups, were given to the Narragansetts, to be called Narragansetts, never to be called Pequot again, and one was given to under the control of Uncas, never to be called Pequot but Mohegan. But probably by 1650, the group under Uncas, who later became the Mashantucket Pequot, were placed back in their homeland in Noank and then given Mashantucket, 1666. Eastern Pequot story is much more complicated. And there were being bounced around by colonial authorities until the reservation 1683. So, the short version of all that.
How did they know how to split them?
Huh?
How did they know how to split the mesh?
I long thought about that. What was the basis? And I suspect it had to do with family group. I think Eastern Pequots had a closer familial or kin relationship with Eastern Niantics, the Mashantucket perhaps with Mohegan. That's a really good question. What was the basis?
I'd like to have you do a lecture on that as far as the organization of the Pequots in general, and then the split.
Yeah, I mean, we know a little bit, but it's very interesting. Yes?
That Groton Open Space acquisition recently, that's the west of North Richard Road.
Yes.
Is there a dig going on there?
There is a dig going on in Pequot Woods east of Noank Ledgerd Road. Oh, yeah, there is. I'm sorry. We've done a little bit of testing and excavation west of Noank Road on a couple of those village sites. Probably nothing to see.
And we saw, the reason I'm asking is there's a tent, a white colored canvas, it looks like miner's tent or
Really?
yeah. I don't know what they're doing there, but it's
Where was this?
north on Noank Ledgerd Road.
Just off Noank Ledgerd Road?
You can see it from Noank Ledgerd Road. There's woods, then there's a house. And behind that house, a little before you get to the house, in the woods, maybe 300 yards in.
So if I'm driving along Noank Ledgerd Road and I'm looking to from Mystic Link to the left, I see it.
Correct.
Oh.
In the summertime, you probably see it.
Surprises me. I've been out there. I hope it's no one doing anything. Yeah.
It's been up for a while. I don't know this right.
Thanks. I'll check it out. I'll get the posse and we'll go. Yes.
What's the status of the battlefield with the Park Service, with the protection program?
We are currently writing up a National Register nomination for all of the Pequot War battlefields. That's been the delay. It's a very complicated process because we're including under a thematic approach all of the battlefields, not just individual ones. So another year, I think. We're just grateful it's preserved for the short term and probably long term by the town of Groton. I really appreciate all the land acquisition people because they take the cultural resources into account as well when they're considering properties, and they've often consulted with us. So we lobbied hard on this one, but they've been terrific in terms of preserving. Yes.
The latest acquisition, which is the Wolfbrook property, have you done any excavations or?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
We have tested or minimally excavated a number of the 4 of the Pequot domestic sites on that side, that property. Most of the effort has been in Pequot Woods with this Kaluna Hill site.
How do you keep other people from interfering with your work?
Usually it's pretty good because, the people who use Pequot Woods are responsible hikers. We had a real problem with one of the local landowners who was vandalizing the site a couple of years ago. But generally, plus you're not going to find it that much anyway. So, they're usually not a problem. But we're always aware whenever a white tent pops up. All right, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you coming. Great,
Thank you, McBride. Outstanding. Thank you very much. And it's a sign of our appreciation.
Oh, you didn't have to
And
do
I
that.
don't know whether you have one of these, but this is the souvenir booklet that was created by a couple of our board members for the bridge centennial.
Cool, thanks.